Hello, my name is Aidan Rupert, alongside me Rob Murray, and welcome to episode 14 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from across the sports world. Whether it's Holy Cross Athletics, NFL Week 10, or anything in between, WCHC Sports 88.1 FM has got you covered. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page and give us a follow on Instagram at WCHC_sports. So last week, Rob and I had a chance to do a USA basketball mock draft with our good friend TJ. And this week, we're going to be getting back into the swing of things after we had some technical difficulties earlier this week. We will be talking about the upcoming season for Holy Cross men's and women's basketball in terms of their scheduling, the latest updates from week 10 of the NFL season, the recent NBA draft and free agency period. But before we get into any of that, Rob and I wanted to devote a few minutes of our show talking about the recent passing of Holy Cross and Boston Celtics legend Tommy Heinsohn, who we learned had passed on November 10th at 86 years old. Heinsohn, for those who may not be aware, he was an All-American who played basketball at Holy Cross from 1953 to 1956, and who went on to become a basketball Hall of Famer as both a player and a coach, and perhaps someday even a broadcaster for the NBA's Boston Celtics. He then spent several decades doing, just as I mentioned, broadcasting, just as Rob and I like to do. And Rob, I really just want to know, what was your initial response to learning of Tom Heinsohn's passing, and just, you know, what sort of knowledge you have about him and his legacy, whether it's Holy Cross or Boston?
Yeah, and it was very difficult hearing about the passing of Tommy Heinsohn. You know, when you think of the famous Holy Cross alums, he certainly tops that list. One of the few great Holy Cross athletes to make it into professional sports and really make an impact at the highest level, which he did with the Boston Celtics. We'll take you through, our audience, a little bit about Tom Heinsohn's career, and I'll start with his days in high school basketball. He had over 300 offers as a player in New Jersey, wanted to go to a Jesuit school, and I was looking at the likes of Fordham, Georgetown, etc., but ultimately came up on Mount St. James and ended up winning the 1954 NIT championship with his Holy Cross Crusaders. And I'm sure much of the audience does not know that the NIT tournament, the National Invitational Tournament, was actually regarded as the more prestigious postseason tournament as opposed to the NCAA tournament we see today. Heinsohn graduated his time at Holy Cross as the college's all-time leading scorer. Right now, he's placed at number 5 all-time, and he's still the all-time leading rebounder at only 6'7" and 218 pounds. And I'll let you finish off the rest of his bio, Aidan, but certainly a very difficult loss for the Holy Cross community, Holy Cross athletics, Boston sports. He was not only a great player, but he was an announcer for that team for a number of years. So thoughts and prayers to Tom Heinsohn and his family, and he certainly won't be forgotten anytime soon on the Hill.
He absolutely will not, Rob. And really, it is and was a sad day when we learned of Tom Heinsohn's passing. But at this point, all we can do as people and as sports fans is celebrate him and some of the wonderful things that he did through a extended career in sports. It's a great call with the 1954 NIT championship he won at Holy Cross. It was the more prestigious basketball tournament at the time. There's actually a great documentary film called College Basketball's Purple Rain, which talks about Holy Cross as a national powerhouse back in the 1950s and the subsequent careers of the likes of Tom Heinsohn, Bob Cousy, among others. And really 6'7", 218 pounds as the Holy Cross all-time leading rebounder. Just let that sink in for 1 second when you talk about, you know, the Jahiva Floyds, the other great big men we've had play in our program. For someone that frail, and for someone who actually, believe it or not, was regarded as somewhat out of shape and a bit doughy throughout most of his NBA career, it's really impressive stuff. But yeah, Rob, as you mentioned, he eventually went on to a career with the NBA's Boston Celtics. He was actually what was known as a territorial draft pick in 1956, meaning that the Celtics, being based in Boston, had essentially the rights to him as a college basketball player in New England, in Worcester. And so Heinsohn played for the Celtics 1956 until 1965. He retired somewhat prematurely due to an injury, although just playing 9 years wasn't that unordinary at the time. But he played along some legends, such as we mentioned, Bob Cousy, as well as the great Bill Russell. And throughout Heinsohn's career as a player, he won the Rookie of the Year award. He was a 6-time All-Star in just his 9 seasons. And how about this one, Rob? An 8-time champion, including leading the Celtics to their very first championship in franchise history in a Game 7 in which Heinsohn, the rookie, dropped 37 points and 23 rebounds. So doughy or not, he certainly produced on both ends of the floor. And in addition to his 8 championships as a player, he ended up winning 2 more as a coach and was involved. And Rob, this is interesting. Tom Heinsohn is the lone member of Boston Celtics history that was involved in some capacity with each of the franchise's 17 championships, whether as a player, a coach, or a broadcaster. He was there for it all. And he formed legendary basketball commentary duo with Mike Gorman of NBC Sports Boston. And really, he was doing games up through this past season even. He wasn't out on the road for games this year. Scalabrine was sort of ushered into that role, and we can talk about Brian Scalabrine as a broadcaster some other time. I love the dude. But yeah, Heinsohn, really, he is, as many have said over this past week and a half, he was the fabric that really just tied together virtually all of Boston Celtics history.
Yeah, if you talk about the pedigree of the Boston Celtics as a franchise, arguably the most prestigious franchise in the history of the NBA, you can't go without mentioning Tom Heinsohn, like you said, involved with every one of the Boston Celtics championships, whether it was as a player, a coach, or team broadcaster. And in high school and college, it was no different. His winning ways didn't end. He averaged 22 points and 15 and a half rebounds over 81 games at Holy Cross. You mentioned him being the all-time leader in rebounds with 1,254 by the end of his 3 years. So he didn't even play all 4 years. He played 3 seasons at Holy Cross and still put up those kinds of numbers. So I'm a true legend in every respect of the game, whether it was on the sidelines, on the court, or in the broadcast booth. We'll always remember Tom Heinsohn for what he did on and off the court. He was regarded as an extremely talented painter whose works would sell for thousands of dollars at auctions, which is something I find very interesting. And on the basketball floor, we'll always think of him as a great hustler. He awarded Tommy points, as he called it, to Celtics players for outstanding hustle during the games he would play. So really just a model citizen and a model athlete for his time and for all time. Tom Heinsohn, rest in peace.
I'm really glad, Rob, you mentioned his career as an artist, as a painter. It's actually something that didn't necessarily surface all too often prior to his passing, but as people are delivering these tributes and remembering him for all of his work, it is true. The man could paint with the best of them. So certainly a man of many talents. And as a broadcaster, Rob, he is what you and I refer to as a homer, and unabashedly so, as he would incessantly go after the referees during games, all out of love for his Boston Celtics, of course. But, his favorite phrases were, "That's a Mickey Mouse foul. That's horrible," not horrible, mind you, horrible. "That's a terrible call," and much, much more. So he's someone, obviously, as a Crusader and a diehard Boston Celtics fan, and someone involved in sports broadcasting, he has long been an inspiration for me, and I'm sure you as well, Rob. So certainly it was a difficult day, but all we can do, once again, is just remember Tom Heinsohn for the Renaissance man and great basketball player that he was.
That's for sure, Aidan. And While we're on the topic of Holy Cross basketball, let's shift from the past to the present and talk about the upcoming men and women's seasons. We were discussing the logistics of the men's season just a few minutes ago before recording, and we were sort of taken aback not only by, unfortunately, how few games are being played for the Holy Cross men's team, but in what fashion they're being played in. There are a lot of back-to-back games. Pretty much, I think now that I'm looking through it, every single set of games is a back-to-back on the weekends, no less. No more weekday games for the Crusaders. And a lot of these back-to-backs on the weekends are not played at the same location. For example, Holy Cross, they open the season at home against Boston University on a Saturday, and then on a Sunday, January 3rd, they travel to Boston University to finish up that 2-game stint, and they do so pretty much for the rest of the season, with the exception of an away back-to-back January 16th and 17th against Colgate, and then hosting Colgate February 13th and 14th for a home back-to-back. So it's obvious the Patriot League is doing as much as they can to make sure we actually get a men's basketball season, in the books this time around. And we've said it since day one of this podcast. We hope that they're able to be successful in doing so. But I'd like to get your thoughts on how you think this schedule is going to work, and if you think it'll present any unique problems or perhaps opportunities for a Holy Cross team that is very young, lost a lot of players in the off season, and has really had limited time and resources to practice and get a full squad together before opening day.
Yeah, Rob, you asked me about the schedule, and I think the question is not so much what's unique about it, it's what's not unique about the schedule. I mean, it is a grind. As you mentioned, it is every weekend, and it's only weekends. And there's going to be a lot of bus travel. For the sake of the players and coaches, I really hope everyone invests in a really good neck pillow, as there's going to be a lot of back and forth, because as you mentioned, many of those home and home series are actually not necessarily, they're not the closest matchups you could have. Obviously, we have Boston University just down the turnpike. Colgate's not too bad, but we're still playing Army, still playing Lehigh. So it's going to be a lot on these players. And just talk about the familiarity you're going to end up having with some of these opponents. Boston University is scheduled to play our Crusaders 6 times during the season. And so it's going to be interesting, to say the least. I know that across some sports, really, the divisional rivalries tend to take up most of a team's scheduling, and so there's less scouting involved, but at the same time, you really have to be ready for everything. And I think just in terms of the psyche of a team, if you're Holy Cross and you run up against a squad you simply cannot get the best of, you're obviously going to be very demoralized headed into the Patriot League tournament if you should end up with a team that you went 1-5 against, or say, God forbid, 0-6 against. And so that's a challenge that's not necessarily presented during a typical season, in that even if you lose to a Patriot League opponent twice during conference play, it's still anyone's game when it comes to the Patriot League tournament. But if you realize that a team simply has your number, it's going to be tough to bounce back from. But the one last thing I'll say is, obviously I just mentioned the weekend games. It will be really interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, this is not a conventional college basketball season in any sense. You have fewer, should I say, distractions as a college athlete, as obviously occurs in the college experience. But you wonder, for a program like the Holy Cross men's team, who has, as you mentioned, Rob, so many new faces, whether they're incoming first years or transfer players, you have so many new players on that roster, and you just wonder, could maybe you use a distraction or some team bonding here and there? Or are these guys just going to maybe get sick of each other after training together for so many months and being stuck on the bus, not a flight, mind you, but a bus every single weekend of the upcoming season? And the one thing I will throw back your way, Rob, is we have seen in the past that the Patriot League across many sports, it does tend to take after the Ivy League in its approach to scheduling and especially, the viability of playing sports in the midst of a pandemic. And that said, the Ivy League recently decided, unfortunately, to cancel all of its winter sports for 2020, 2021. It's obviously so unfortunate for all Ivy League coaches, athletes, and fans. And I'm not going to ask you, Rob, if you expect the same for Holy Cross basketball. That simply would not be a fair question at this point in time. But what do you think about just all that's gone into preparing for the season across all of these winter sports teams that don't necessarily know, with maybe the exception of hockey, men's and women's, that their season will in fact occur?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult thing to grapple with because you put yourself in the shoes of some of these student athletes. They've been doing all they can to make sure they're getting onto the floor safely and that they're gelling with their teammates. And in the case of the men's team for basketball, getting to know perhaps a whole new roster of teammates. So when you're out there grinding each and every day and taking the necessary precautions to play basketball in the midst of a pandemic, like you said, it's got to be somewhat demoralizing to know that the end might be coming tomorrow for all we know. In terms of a college basketball season, the Ivy League has been usually the first domino to fall, so to speak, across the collegiate sports landscape. We saw it back in the spring when all this was just starting. So while I'm obviously not ready to jump to any conclusions just yet, it's definitely something to be mindful of because the Patriot League has followed in the Ivy League's footsteps before. And if history is any indication of whether or not that'll happen again, we might be in for a disappointment come January 2nd when the men's team and the women's team, who actually, now that I'm looking at their schedule, plays the exact same number of games that the men's team does. It looks like they'll be traveling together for all of their games. They play BU 6 times as well. They have home and away back-to-backs against Colgate in January and February, respectively. So, yeah, both of these teams are going to get a lot of face time with one another. Hopefully, they'll get used to traveling together as well. But all I can do is just wish them the best of luck that they can return to play and make us proud this season.
And as we stand right now, Rob, at the time of recording, we are 43 days away from the scheduled start of Patriot League basketball. And one last comment I'll leave you with is, if you're familiar with the Turnpike Trophy whatsoever, it's essentially a year-long competition that occurs between Holy Cross Athletics and Boston University Athletics across all sports to see who can capture the most victories to score points in the Turnpike Trophy. And it's going to be really interesting this year. Quite frankly, we have, as mentioned, 6 matchups between the men's teams for Holy Cross and BU, and presumably the women's team as well. So there are 12 points of your Turnpike Trophy at hand or at stake in basketball alone. So if that's something that you as a sports fan tend to keep your eye on, then be sure to tune into some of those basketball matchups, as they are obviously going to occur and they are going to weigh heavily.
Absolutely. Who says the Patriot League has nothing to play for? I mean, come on. Why? Who wouldn't want to play for the Turnpike Trophy? But enough of Holy Cross basketball. We'll obviously keep you guys updated with any news on that subject. As, like you said, Aidan, 43 days away, just about 6 weeks from the men's and women's basketball teams tipping off. Let's move on to the NFL. We just had a Week 11 matchup finish last night. The Cardinals and the Seahawks played on Thursday Night Football in Seattle. The Seahawks, who were coming off a 3-game losing streak, looking like they were on the ropes a little bit in the middle of the season, took care of the Cardinals 28-21. And the Cardinals, who were coming off an extraordinary win at, unfortunately, at the expense of your Buffalo Bills. I don't know if you watched the game. Time expiring, Kyler Murray, 43-yard touchdown pass to DeAndre Hopkins. As time expired, he caught it over, I think it was 3 or 4 defenders. And the Cardinals at the time stayed alive for first place in the NFC West. Since they dropped a game against the Seahawks, they fall to second place in that division. But it was a missed opportunity for the Bills for a huge road win. They fall to 7-3, still firmly in the lead of that AFC East. And before I get your opinion on the Bills game, Aidan, I'd like to bring up the Houston Texans and what they did this Sunday, because they are forever going to be the team linked with the success of Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins. It's pretty clear and obvious why that is. The Texans traded DeAndre Hopkins for a pretty minuscule haul in the eyes of many NFL fans. And the Texans, who lost 10-7 to the Cleveland Browns this Sunday, had their leading receiver muster just 39 receiving yards. So if you're a Houston Texans fan and you're looking at what your team did versus what DeAndre Hopkins just did to the Bills this past Sunday, you can't be feeling too good about that.
No, absolutely not, Rob. And obviously, it's worth mentioning that losing to the Cleveland Browns doesn't quite carry the same weight as perhaps it did just a few years back. But at the same time, you are obviously a team, as you mentioned, traded Hopkins, and you still had some expectations going into the season, even if that was kind of a boneheaded trade in a sense. And so it was a weak showing, to say the least, and they're really out of it for all intents and purposes at this stage of the game. But yeah, that DeAndre Hopkins catch, that was sort of a bit of a screw you to the Houston Texans, if you will, as well as a big screw you to the Buffalo Bills, because obviously they caught really the worst of that after making a play themselves to go ahead in that matchup. Unfortunately, they fell short. Once again, the final score being 32-30. Kyler Murray, though, he is doing some ridiculous things this season. I was listening to a sports podcast that was talking about fantasy sports. And I don't know if you knew this, Rob. He is, as a quarterback, he is a viable option for fantasy teams based solely on his running game. If you take his passing game out of the equation, he's still a very solid option for your fantasy lineup. And so, it was difficult. Obviously, Buffalo has really generally had a lot of momentum this season, with a couple of blips here and there. Even in their victory recently against the New York Jets, we mentioned on another podcast, they didn't even score a touchdown. But yeah, is that play, though, from Kyler Murray to DeAndre Hopkins, is that your play of the year so far?
I think it has to be. Whenever you get a Hail Mary to win the game like that, it certainly has to draw out some consideration. And I loved your point about Kyler Murray in fantasy. I'm looking at his season stats right now. He's rushed for over 60 yards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games out of the 10 that he's played so far this season. So he's been incredible. He's actually been outpacing the numbers Lamar Jackson had last season when he won the MVP. And Kyler is maybe following the trend, if he runs away with the MVP this season, of second-year quarterbacks who had solid rookie seasons and then just burst onto the scene in year two. You had Patrick Mahomes, who actually didn't really have much of a rookie season. He played one game the year he was drafted, and then proceeded to throw 50 touchdowns in year two en route to his MVP. You had Lamar Jackson, who went, I think, 6-1 as a starter in his rookie year before running all over the NFL in year two in 2019. And now in 2020, Kyler Murray had an up and down first season. He suffered at the expense of a pretty terrible offensive line. His defense didn't do many favors. He had a pretty incompetent coaching staff compared to the one that he has now. But he's just been unbelievable so far for the Cardinals. And if you forget, Aidan, he got drafted by the Oakland A's. I believe it was 3 years ago, 7th overall in the MLB draft. A lot of people don't remember that he played outfield at the University of Oklahoma. So when you think of players who tried to play two professional sports at once, you think of guys like Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders. So he is certainly a guy to watch out for later on this season. But let's move on to what the Patriots did this past Sunday. They got a pretty ugly win against the Ravens, 23-17. They racked up over 170 rushing yards in a rather quiet win, but it leads me to think that a punishing ground game is really their winning formula. They've rushed for over 100 yards in 7 of 9 games. They've gone 4-2 in rushing for over 150 yards. So they might not be offensive attack that we discussed, Aidan, earlier in the year when Cam Newton was throwing all over everyone and really looking like he had returned to MVP form. He's certainly come down from that point as the season has progressed, but Patriots sit at 5-5 or 4-5. I'm sorry, and are still in the hunt despite having a pretty quiet first half of the season. You can chalk it up to Bill Belichick and his coaching staff. You can chalk it up to the organization as a whole. But I'm very impressed with what the Patriots have been able to overcome, considering all the COVID issues they've had, and of course the loss of their Hall of Fame quarterback, Tom Brady.
Well, Rob, what else you can chalk it up to? Not just the players and coaches. You can chalk it up to the weather. And maybe that is, in fact, attributable to Bill Belichick. It would seem as though Belichick does, in fact, control the weather, or else has a direct pipeline to the man upstairs. As I don't know if you saw sort of the last couple of plays or the last drive for the Patriots against the Ravens, but essentially a monsoon, a lot of people are saying, led to their victory in the fourth quarter. I'm not sure if that's indeed the case. I think there's certainly validity to the argument. They could have pulled it out regardless, especially when you think about some of the numbers and strengths of theirs that you just mentioned. But it was sort of just a bit of an interesting tidbit from NFL Week 10. And it's sort of one of those things that even after losing your Hall of Fame quarterback, it's just enough to give the Patriot fans all around this country, especially the Northeast, just a sliver of hope. And I don't know about you, Rob, but I hate that.
Yeah, I can't say I'm too excited about that either. But you're right. The weather in that game ended up playing to a lot of the Patriots' strength. They've always had a solid defense as long as Bill Belichick has been at the helm. And like I said before, their ground game has really been the saving grace for their offense all year. Around the rest of the NFL, we talked about the Seahawks getting off of their 3-game losing streak. My Chicago Bears, man, they are losers of their last 4 games. They started out 5-1. They currently sit at 5-5 and seem to be in the midst of yet another quarterback controversy. There's been talks about Mitch Trubisky coming back as the starting quarterback, as horrible as that sounds, because the offense just hasn't been able to generate anything. I think they've gone 4 games now where they haven't scored an offensive touchdown in the first half, which is just mind-boggling. It's really astonishing how bad their offense has been. And if I can speak candidly as a Bears fan, I think they should explore trading Khalil Mack next season, simply because I think they're much closer to a full rebuild than they are being any sort of playoff contender. And it's too bad because I think they've wasted the prime years of a really great defense with just incompetence on the offensive side. But I'll quit ranting for now. In the AFC, the Steelers remained undefeated with a 26-point victory over the Bengals. They're 9-0. Look to be on track to the AFC title game matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs. And the Dolphins, also in the AFC, emerging as a bit of a dark horse. They've won 5 in a row, 6 of their last 7. And they've done it all behind the 5th-ranked defense in 2020. And their rookie quarterback, Tua Tagovailoa, who is currently 3-0. I think they just sit half a game behind your Bills, Aidan. So are you worried at all about how well the Dolphins are playing? And if somehow, after a really up and down season for them last year, could end up winning the division title in the craziest of all years, 2020.
You're right, Rob. 2020, if there's any time to do it, it's right now. And it's sort of interesting. It's both the Bills and the Dolphins, just less than a decade ago, both were sort of regarded as the laughingstock of the AFC East. And here we are going head to head, ahead in the standings of the likes of the Patriots, and we won't mention the Jets, of course, at 0-9. But yeah, a bit of an ironic twist, of course, that has unfolded this season. And let's not forget what a successful year it has been for Florida sports. And so Miami Dolphins, obviously they are hoping to, pick up some of the momentum that we saw from the Miami Heat, we saw from Tampa Bay, the Lightning, and now our new Tampa Bay Toronto Raptors, as just today it was reported that the Canadian government will not allow the Raptors to play at Air Canada for at least the beginning of the NBA season. So sorry to go off on an NBA tangent, but just one more instance of God or someone out there smiling down on the state of Florida for once.
That's exactly right. And I like how you made that transition to the NBA. That's doing what you do best. The Dolphins looking for their first playoff win since 2000, and the Bills looking for their first playoff win since 1995. So, assuming the Patriots stay out of the picture and the Jets, who will obviously remain at rock bottom in that AFC East, you could possibly see some long-time losing droughts in the postseason come to an end in all years, being 2020. So that was a great NFL recap. But Aidan, we also had some NBA draft and free agency rumblings going on this past week. I'll start us off with the draft because my Chicago Bulls had their number 4 selection this past Wednesday. They went with Patrick Williams, small forward out of Florida State. And I'll admit I wasn't somebody who was necessarily keeping track of all of the prospects outside of the top 3. Obviously, the narrative was Anthony Edwards, James Wiseman, and LaMelo Ball all having a legitimate chance at going number 1 to the Timberwolves. But Patrick Williams was a guy who was a fringe top 10 player for some people and a top 15 player for a lot of others. And while I don't think the Bulls were necessarily going with the best available player, I think they drafted a pretty good fit in Patrick Williams. He was the 6th man of the year in the ACC last season. He's proven to be a pretty versatile player on both ends of the court, very energetic and athletic defensively. He's a pretty long player for his position, and I think he fits in pretty well with the Bulls starting lineup should he eventually come in. We obviously have Kobe White and Zach LaVine at the guard positions, Lauri Markkanen and Wendell Carter as our big man manning the post. And once Otto Porter leaves next season, who, can't get out of Chicago quick enough at $28 million a year, which is what he's being paid, I think Patrick Williams will fit in just fine, and I'm excited to see what he can do for this team. And who knows, maybe I'll be excited about Bulls basketball for the first time in years, going back to the days of Derrick Rose and Tom Thibodeau.
Yeah, you know what, Rob? You as a Bulls fan, I'll just tell you straight up, you likely were not alone in thinking that this pick was maybe a bit of a reach. As you mentioned, some people had him going in that 10 to 15 range, or perhaps even later. And so it was interesting. I think that it definitely does fill a positional need when you talk about Otto Porter. He only has a year or so left on his deal. And so they're hoping maybe they can groom him from the bench role that actually he played in college, keep in mind, into eventually transitioning to that starting lineup. But yeah, I mean, you talk about the timeline of this group. It is clear that they are in no particular rush, although I'm sure you and I both would like to see things sped up just a little bit, which may occur under their new management and coach. But, Zach LaVine, he's been in the league quite some time, but he is only still 25 years of age. And as freakishly athletic as he is, he's a player that I really respect how he has really improved his overall game. He's not so utterly reliant on that transcendent athleticism as he perhaps was in his early years in Minnesota and maybe even moving to Chicago. But, we talked Bulls. I think it's only fair that you and I give just a couple of minutes to my Boston Celtics, who actually, they had 3 first-round draft picks at numbers 15, 26, and 30. And therefore, a lot of people were expecting them to make some noise and perhaps move up in the draft. Word on the street is they had their eyes also on James Wiseman before the Warriors elected to select him number 2. And they actually went number 15 with Aaron Naismith, who a lot of a lot of scouts and a lot of people around the league, they regard as the best pure shooter in this draft, a comment that Aaron himself actually just echoed in a recent interview with the Celtics. And I think it's a very smart pick in that the Celtics really do need to address shooting and scoring off of the bench. I am frankly somewhat disappointed that they were not able to consolidate those three draft picks, those three assets in moving up in the draft or maybe making a splash elsewhere via trade. But if they were going to draft, I really do think that they picked pretty well. I don't think they saw the big man in front of them that, half of the NBA fan base thinks that they need, which they may in fact need. And we'll get to some of the moves that they made in just a minute here too. But yeah, I think it was a smart draft. They didn't try and do too much. And I don't think you can really fault them for that. They ended up taking Desmond Bane, number 30 out of TCU, and Peyton Pritchard, a savvy point guard out of Oregon, who actually I had a chance to watch a couple of times this past season playing against University of Washington, where my high school teammate Isaiah Stewart, he was actually selected 16 in the draft to the Detroit Pistons. So shout out to Rochester, New York. Had to put it on the podcast. But yeah, Pritchard, he's a savvy point guard, and I think he's going to fit in well in Boston.
Yeah, Pritchard was a guy who was obviously drafted later in the first round, but still caught my attention. He's one of those college players who actually got a Wooden nomination for the nation's best player in 2020, but whose skill set and perhaps athletic build may not translate as well as some of the other guys in the top 5 or top 10. But Aidan, you mentioned Aaron Nesmith being regarded as the best pure shooter and three-point shooter in the draft, and that's exactly the same analysis I heard from the broadcast I was watching. I thought a team like the Pelicans at number 13 would take a shot with him, with Zion Williamson obviously cutting and slashing the paint and surrounding him with as much shooting talent as possible. But they decided to go in another direction, and he fell to you guys, which, again, I think will be a very good asset for a guy like Jason Tatum, who likes to post up and use his inside game to draw on the defense and ultimately kick out to shooters if he needs to do so. And Aidan, one question I'd like to ask you is 3 first-round picks for the Celtics, and I believe that they have multiple first-round picks next season as well. Are these all coming from the infamous Brooklyn Nets trade with Kevin Durant and Paul Pierce, or is that stockpile of draft picks burned itself out?
You know what? I could be mistaken on this, Rob, but I'm pretty sure you are only allowed to trade draft picks up to 5 years from the time of the trade. So that trade occurring after 2013? Yes, summer of 2013. So those clearly must be expired by now. But I think that one of those picks turned into either Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum. So obviously a bit of finessing on Trader Danny's part. And obviously I also appreciate the shout out to that trade. Absolutely swindled the Brooklyn Nets. But yeah, once again, a lot of Celtics fans really expected them to sort of consolidate their assets and maybe make a move for a top pick or a player elsewhere in the league. But we could be seeing such still from the Boston Celtics, as Gordon Hayward just today actually chose to opt out of his player option for next season, and thus he is a unrestricted free agent. And all of the signs currently point toward him heading to the Indiana Pacers. He obviously played basketball at Butler and is from Indiana, but we're not quite sure as Celtics fans yet what exactly this move to Indiana, if it indeed occurs, what it's going to look like. Because from a financial perspective, Indiana could certainly stand to benefit from performing a sign and trade for Hayward. And there's been a lot of talk there about how their big men, all-star Sabonis and Miles Turner, simply cannot coexist. And Miles Turner, Rob, if you're not aware, he is someone who for years has been involved in potential trade talks to the Boston Celtics, but it's never actually occurred. And so what we're seeing right now also is the Celtics, they traded center Enes Kanter today back to the Portland Trailblazers. Just yesterday, they traded seventh string center Vincent Poirier over to OKC, a player who I'm actually not a fan of, I will admit. He's my least favorite Celtic, but good luck, Vincent. So yeah, really what we're seeing right now is a whole lot of smoke surrounding Gordon Hayward. It seems as though he's headed to Indiana, but nobody can say that for certain. And nobody is certain, similarly, of what exactly the Celtics may receive in return, if anything.
Yeah, Aidan, I was honestly taken aback by Hayward's decision to opt out and look for another team. He was getting paid a lot of money with the Boston Celtics, and given his sort of sketchy injury history the past few seasons with Boston, I was expecting him to be quite frank, take the money and stay with the Celtics. And why wouldn't you? You have that financial security that is so important to so many athletes, and you have a team in the Boston Celtics who are coming off a conference finals appearance and just 2 games away from an NBA finals appearance, and who are also led by a young core who seem destined to get back to that promised land in the very near future. So I understand him wanting to come home and play for Indiana. That close to home factor is important to a lot of guys, but I was kind of taken aback by Gordon Hayward's decision. And, Aiden, we were talking about the Brooklyn Nets and their just complete failure of that trade back in 2013. But the Nets have been at the center of NBA trade and free agency talks for the last 2 weeks or so. And that is because James Harden has listed the Brooklyn Nets among other teams like the Philadelphia 76ers as a desirable trade destination, as he hopes to link up with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. And if this trade somehow gets done, we could have a crash course with a team like the Los Angeles Lakers in the NBA Finals, where you'd have James Harden, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, LeBron James, and Anthony Davis all on one floor playing for the title. I don't know about you, that certainly gets me excited. And before I hand things off to you, I'd also like to bring up James Harden turned down 2 years, and I believe it was $106 million from the Houston Rockets, getting over $50 million a year, which I think may have beaten out Patrick Mahomes ever so slightly for the highest average annual value in an American sports contract. So, if that was not a clear indicator of how much James Harden wants to move on to a championship contender, I don't know what else would top that. But yeah, let me get your thoughts on a potentially landscape-altering trade in James Harden, potentially to the Brooklyn Nets or the 76ers.
It's something that I'm struggling to understand, not because it doesn't make sense from Harden's perspective to perhaps want to move on. There are rumors out there, crazy rumors perhaps, but rumors nonetheless, that the team owner's political stance is actually perhaps a driving force for Harden, why he wants to go and get out of Houston. I'm not sure if I really subscribe to that school of thought, though it is worth mentioning. The money, obviously, it's big time. You're right, Rob. He would have become the first annual $50 million a year player in NBA history. And so turning down money that big, it sort of tells you something. And I think that things that Harden wants to win, and he's simply convinced that that cannot be the case in Houston right now. Obviously, D'Antoni's out, and I know you and I joked about on the podcast how many times can you run the same thing back over and over again and expect it to work. And I think Houston maybe finally realized that, but unfortunately, in so doing, it may end up costing them not only James Harden, but let's not forget Russell Westbrook apparently wants out of Houston as well. These are rumors that have been disputed, but they are once again rumors. And Rob, you and I haven't really had any breaking news live responses on the podcast since we started doing this, but we have some breaking news in that John Wall of the Washington Wizards is now outspoken in demanding a trade. And where there is smoke, there is fire. And there has been a lot of smoke surrounding John Wall, a potential swap for Russell Westbrook of the Rockets over the past few days or so. And so I think that a trade between those two is not only a possibility, but perhaps even likely at this point. But we will mention a couple other trades, but real quick, Rob, do you think there's any situation in which both Houston or both Westbrook and Harden are out of Houston in just a few weeks?
I think it could be a very real possibility. I think Westbrook would probably be the one to go first if I had to say. I think Harden's been a little more outspoken about where he wants to go, but the thing with Houston Rockets management is that they've said they're willing to be conservative in this process and hold Westbrook and Harden for as long as they see fit. So we could very well have both of them in a Houston uniform at the beginning of the 2020-2021 season. So, if I had to make a prediction, I think James Harden sticks around this year for the Houston Rockets. I think Russell Westbrook is on another team. Whoever that team is yet to be seen. I can't really think of anybody who would be, so quick to get him, especially after the playoff performance he's had and the price tag he's currently going at right now. I think it's upwards of $35 million, maybe even 40. So he's, an aging player who has his fair share of shooting issues, and he comes at a hefty price. So it's going to be tough to move a guy like Russell Westbrook. You talk about explosive guards like Westbrook and John Wall. A bit of not so breaking news that happened a few hours ago. We had De'Aaron Fox getting a 5-year, $160 million deal with the Sacramento Kings. The incentives could push that up to as much as $195 million. So congrats to De'Aaron Fox for getting his bag. He's going to be a long-time player for that Sacramento Kings franchise if all goes well. But yeah, a lot going on in the last few days of NBA free agency. We'll certainly get some more news as the weeks go on. We have a potential trade sending Bojan Bogdanovic to the Milwaukee Bucks. So
that one fell through, actually, Rob. I don't know if
it did. Oh, it did fall through. Okay,
but we will.
I know it was on kind of shaky ground. I didn't know if the teams were still trying to work it out, but yeah, I know they got Drew Holiday, but that's tough.
So now people are talking about Bogdanovic potentially to the Golden State Warriors, who we should mention tragically even just lost Klay Thompson to an Achilles injury. And so that's not to say Milwaukee is necessarily in any kind of trouble, as they were able to flip Eric Bledsoe, among others, into Drew Holiday of the New Orleans Pelicans. And so they've put together a very strong start to their offseason themselves. And the one other trade that I want to get your thoughts on is the Chris Paul deal. We see Oklahoma City, they are absolutely tearing things down right now. Not only were they willing to absorb the horrendous contract of Philadelphia's Al Horford. In Philadelphia, by the way, they have pulled off some savvy trades over the past 72 hours. But OKC actually shipped off Chris Paul to Phoenix, of all places. And it sort of makes you wonder, does Phoenix maybe know something that we don't? Obviously, we saw the Bubble Suns, perhaps one of the most compelling NBA storylines of the entire season. Do they really think that they have a shot to compete out west with a player like Chris Paul at the helm instead of Ricky Rubio?
In as much as I don't think the Suns are going to make a whole lot of noise, especially in the West when you have so many good teams out there, but I love the move for the Suns. I love watching Chris Paul. He's just got so much energy, especially at a guy his age. And he's got a lot of experience he can bring to a team that young with guys like DeAndre Ayton and Devin Booker, who hopefully wants to stick around now that he's got some help in the backcourt. But, good on the Suns. They've kind of been hovering around mediocrity or even towards the bottom of the league for, I feel like, the past decade, ever since that Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire combination was laid to rest. So, good on the Suns for making a little bit of a push, trying to get competitive in that Western Conference, maybe trying to push their guys to develop a little quicker, get them used to playing, real playoff basketball. I know the bubble format was sort of a faux playoff scenario for those guys to witness. But while I don't think it will end up doing too much in the grand scheme of things for Phoenix, I like the move. It shows they're willing to be competitive and take some chances, which they haven't seemed to be all too keen on doing the past few seasons. And on the Thunder's end, I think now they have 18 first-round picks across the next 6 years. So if we're not seeing an Oklahoma City Thunder dynasty as we approach 2030, something's going wrong. So it's gonna be really interesting to see what they do with the majority of those picks. Are they gonna, use them to build up a roster in the future? Are they gonna trade them to bring some all-star talent in, especially after the success of last season? That is yet to be seen. But like I said before, a lot of exciting stuff going on, and I love what the Suns and the Thunder both did. I think it was a mutually beneficial deal that got done this past weekend.
Couldn't agree with you more on all of those points, Rob. Obviously, once again, there are simply too many signings and trades for us to get to. Other miscellaneous deals include, as mentioned, the Philadelphia 76ers traded Josh Richardson and got back Seth Curry in return. Other signings include Christian Wood, allegedly to the Houston Rockets, though this has not yet been finalized. And really just a variety of moves, whether major or minor around the league. You got Kelly Oubre headed to Golden State Warriors. But Rob, you and I will continue to discuss this in episodes moving forward, as obviously it's just a flurry of news between the draft and free agency. Virtually no time for us to breathe between all this.
It's a lot to handle, but we'll come at it as best we can. But let's start to wrap this up with our assists, fumbles, and what to watch for. I'll start off with a little bit of golf. We had the Masters being played in November. Now, obviously, far and away from its usual time in April. We had Dustin Johnson win the tournament at 20 under, which was the lowest scoring 4 rounds in tournament history. It was his second major, his first dating back to the 2016 U.S. Open. And obviously, all eyes were on Tiger Woods this year as he was the champion last season. He had a strong opening round. I think he was -4. Sort of plateaued in rounds 2 and 3. I think he shot a combined 1 under. So he was sitting 5 under going into the final round. And he laid an absolute egg on the 12th hole. He hit the ball into the water 3 times, ended up finishing with a 10 on that hole. So that ended up bringing him all the way back down to, I think, 4 over par. He ended up birdieing, actually, I think it was 6 of the last 7 holes he finished. So Tiger Woods, perhaps the greatest golfer of all time, finishing strong, understanding that that was an uncharacteristic 12th hole out of him. So he ended up finishing around 3 under for the tournament. But props to Dustin Johnson. He dominated the field wire to wire and ended up setting a record in the process. So that was my assist of the week.
Certainly, Rob, a bit of maybe a senior moment, if one can call it that, from Tiger Woods. But he still has some game left, and I wouldn't be too worried. And congratulations, obviously, to Dustin Johnson. For my assist for this week, I once again just want to reiterate sort of a lot of feel-good moments in sports that emerged from a moment of great sadness, and that was the outpouring of support that we saw across much of the sports world following Tom Heinsohn's unfortunate passing recently. I was actually listening to the Bill Simmons podcast. Bill Simmons, of course, is a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross himself and one of the most prominent figures across all of sports commentating. And it was a wonderful podcast. It was really touching. He actually had his dad on the program, and Bill Simmons was able to catch sort of the tail end of Heinsohn's coaching career and that sort of involvement. Whereas his dad, this is why he had him on the podcast, he was really there following Heinsohn in his journey as a player, and then as a coach, and then as a broadcaster all the way through. So he had some wonderful stories to tell about Heinsohn and just how he looked after his very ill wife who would attend the Celtics games. He would literally go get up from his broadcasting booth during timeouts in between quarters just to check on her. Talked also about, you and I mentioned, Rob, Heinsohn's painting career. And so really just there are, obviously, for every reason we have to be sad about Tom Heinsohn's passing, we have 2 or 3 reasons to be happy just about what he was able to do. And so assist of the week goes to Tom Heinsohn and all those who have worked to really commemorate all that he did for sports.
Absolutely. Very well put, Aidan. He just seemed like an incredible person that, like you said, left behind certainly a lot more good than bad in his passing. Let's move on to, I'm going to call this our joint fumble of the week because while I don't have one this week, I'm aware of your fumble that happened in the NBA draft. You had first overall pick Anthony Edwards. I'll let you read the quote, and you're the one who found it, and I'll react to, because it was certainly questionable things coming out of the mouth of the first overall pick from Georgia.
All right, Rob, appreciate it. Here's what we got from the number 1 pick to Minnesota. And I quote, "I feel like the pandemic is nothing to me. I was already living in the pandemic because all I wanted to do is to get better." And that is your number 1 overall pick. I do understand what he was trying to say. I think it came across as slightly tone deaf and maybe just a little bit ignorant, maybe just a little bit confused. But I don't know, Rob, what are your thoughts? And obviously Anthony Edwards, not to return to our ties of blasting Georgia, Atlanta sports, but he is a Georgia guy, so I'm not sure if that factors into any of this.
Yeah, even first round picks are not safe on this podcast, especially when they're from the Atlanta, Georgia area. But yeah, it was some questionable words from Anthony Edwards. I don't think he was necessarily facilitating any ill will at all. I think he just misspoke. But the comment that actually raised my eyebrows a little more than what you brought up, Aidan, is the fact that not only does he prefer watching football to basketball, which is understandable. I'm in that camp. I don't think you are, but we can let bygones be bygones. But Edwards would leave basketball behind if he was drafted into the NFL, and you wonder if that was him maybe trying to get the Timberwolves to pass on him with the number 1 pick, or if he's just not all that committed to the NBA as a whole. He was a stud as a high school football player, but ended up picking up basketball in high school as well, and the rest is history. So he really joins LaMelo Ball for me in 2 lottery picks that have had their motivation and commitment to the game of basketball and to their team come into question. And as the Timberwolves, that's certainly something you don't want to hear out of a guy who you're getting ready to build your future around.
Well, you know what, Rob? It's not only LaMelo and Edwards. James Wiseman also. I mean, not so much his commitment that's been questioned, but
right.
There are question marks nonetheless, as he played a meager 3 games at Memphis. And so each of those guys, they sort of had their question marks beyond just the aloof comments and nature we've seen from Anthony Edwards. He's also a player, he was notably quite inefficient during his freshman year. He obviously could score the basketball with the best of them. There's no debating that. But when you talk about players that have gone to be selected number 1, he's one of the most efficient in the pack. And so we know all about number 1 overall picks named Anthony, and the jury's still out on whether or not Anthony Edwards will be an Anthony Davis or if he's going to be an Anthony Bennett. But regardless, I'm not getting the greatest vibes from Anthony Edwards early on, but I think that and I hate to say this, I think that he wanted to play in Golden State. That's just my take. You can hardly blame him. Minnesota, they have a lot going for them between Russell and Towns and some other pieces, but they're nowhere near the instant contender that you would have with Anthony Edwards playing with Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors. So I think that there may be a little bit of ground to that speculation, Rob. But enough said about Anthony Edwards. We're obviously wishing him a wonderful start to his rookie campaign. Let's move on to what to watch for. I will throw this one over to you to get us started.
So I actually have 2 what to watch for this week. The first one is being the Raiders-Chiefs game this Sunday. Really one of the new rivalries we're seeing in the AFC come to fruition. The Raiders, who defeated the Chiefs in Week 5, took a controversial victory lap, quote unquote, around the stadium in their team buses as they were leaving the venue and getting ready to go home to Las Vegas. And that's really been the topic of conversation surrounding this matchup the past week. The Chiefs using it as a point of motivation, and the Raiders really denying that it ever happened, or denying that there was any ill will or braggadocio, so to speak, involved. So the Chiefs are favored by 8.5 this week. I'm taking them. I'm taking them in the 8.5 points. I think they're ready to make a statement this Sunday. Andy Reid, who's established himself as one of the greatest coaches of all time, let alone one of the best in the NFL right now. He's 18-3 off a bye week. And just going by some of these weekly pressers leading up to Sunday's game, I can tell Pat Mahomes and the Chiefs want this game probably more than any other on their schedule this year. With the way they've been playing all season, how efficient they've been on the offensive side of the ball, and how tough they've been on the defensive side of the ball. Chiefs really not known for holding teams under 25, 20 points, but they've done it this season. They are looking as complete as ever, and I think a young upstart team like the Raiders, who may have a lot of passion, aren't ready for a veteran Super Bowl winning team like the Chiefs, who are particularly hungry after that Week 5 victory lap debacle. And my next what to watch for, you actually reminded me with talking about the Warriors, Aidan. Prayers up to Klay Thompson. It looks like he tore his Achilles in practice right before the NBA draft, which I'm sure threw a wrench into the Warriors draft strategy. They obviously still ended up going with James Wiseman, which was the expected pick. But, I was looking at that Warriors team with Steph, Klay, Draymond, and now a brand new shiny 7-foot center coming out of Memphis as a legitimate contender in the West. You have obviously the Lakers and the Clippers. The Rockets are no longer in the picture. The Thunder have been diminished. You still have the Nuggets and the Jazz hanging around the middle of the pack. But the Warriors were primed to return to, their top 3 perennial contender status. And this is a huge blow for them. I saw them around a 3 or 4 seed with Klay in the lineup, but now I see them hovering around maybe a 5, 6, or even a 7 place in the West. Just a devastating injury. He'll most likely miss all of this season. And I hope he can just get back to full strength and playing against him, because he is one of the most fun NBA players to watch.
Rob, I don't know if you feel the same way, but for the past few years now, I have wished at times nothing but misfortune on the Golden State Warriors following their dynastic rule over the NBA. And now I'm going to say the opposite. I am on the record as saying I hope that the Golden State Warriors are able to land a Bogdanovich. He's obviously a poor man's Klay Thompson, but if you insert him into that lineup, I think you are talking about a team that still can make some noise. I'm not saying you're suggesting they're making no noise without Klay. As you mentioned, he's a big part of it, but they still have more than enough to compete for a playoff spot out west. But if you put another shooter of Bogdanovich's caliber around Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Wiseman, Eric Paschall, Andrew Wiggins, you're still talking about a relatively complete roster if they can just iron out a few bench spots here and there. So, yeah, it's definitely something to watch for, in that you want to know what Golden State's next move is in this offseason game of chess. And that will bring me to my what to watch for this week. And I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I am just going to say what to watch for is NBA insider for ESPN, Adrian Wojnarowski's Twitter account. You and I, we are on the same page in agreeing that there is simply no way to keep up with all of the latest scoop, trades, free agency signings, etc., from this frantic rush of an NBA offseason. We may have mentioned on a previous podcast, this is the shortest offseason in the history of major American sports due to the pandemic. And so there is no good answer, no easy way to keep up, except, Rob, for our guy Woj over at ESPN. So if you're on Twitter, great. Give him a follow. If you're on Bleacher Report, that's okay too. It all ends up there anyway. So if you want the latest NBA scoop, trust me, the WCHC podcast is about once a week. Woj, he's about once a minute. So obviously, give him a shot. God bless Woj.
That's right. And Woj, we trust. He is. We're certainly hard pressed to find a time where he isn't bringing us with all the latest news and updates from the NBA.
True that, Rob. And so that is going to do it now for episode 14 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. We are sorry we're a little bit late on getting this one out this week, but that's okay. We will be better moving forward. And great episode today, Rob. Great to have this prolonged discussion with you on all things Heinsohn, Holy Cross, NFL, and NBA. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And we will catch you not at the same time next week, hopefully, but soon, nevertheless.